Hi everyone, welcome to PolyCloud YouTube channel, your one-stop channel for mastering Microsoft Azure. In the previous model, we have learned about managing Azure identity and governance, and these are all the videos which are already uploaded on the channel. The first three videos are of single part, and after that there are six modules, so they are divided into these videos. If you haven't checked that out yet, make sure you watch those videos. They are very helpful for basic understanding of Azure identities and governance. Now in this module, we are stepping into one of the most essential Azure topic, that is implementing and managing storage. In this part, we will deep dive into Azure storage account and blob. I will just open so let me show you once. These are all the topics which has been already covered in the earlier videos, and in this module, that is implement and manage storage, I've added three videos. So the first one is managing storage account and blobs, learning how to create, configure, secure, and optimize storage account for your cloud workload. So here are what we will cover in this session, that is understanding different Azure storage account, its type, creating them, configuring them, and uploading blobs to them using Azure Portal, PowerShell, and CLI. We will have overview on Storage Explorer, soft delete, and access tier as well. We will implement blob versioning, lifecycle management, and data archival for cost efficiency. So get ready to explore the backbone of Azure data management, that is storage. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell icon to continue your AZ-104 learning journey with PolyCloud. So let's get started.
We know we can use the Azure portal to get blobs into a storage account. We also know we can use PowerShell and the CLI. Here's yet another way to manage blobs in a storage account. We can use the free Azure Storage Explorer GUI tool from Microsoft. If you use your favorite web search engine to search up Azure Storage Explorer, it'll be very easy for you to get to this page where you can actually click Download Now. You can then select the platform. You're going to run this on the Windows platform, the Mac OS. Do you want it as a Linux tar file? So I've already downloaded the Windows version, and I've installed it with the default selections. So I'm going to start the Storage Explorer tool on my local Windows PC. I'll just click the X to close the release notes. So this is the interface. Over in the left-hand navigator, we are looking at the Explorer. And if I drill down under storage accounts, any connections we might have to storage accounts would be here. You've got a local emulator, but we're not connected to our Azure account. Now, if I click the plug icon over on the left, which means connect, it says what kind of Azure resource do you want to connect to, an entire subscription, or a storage account or service, or a specific blob container, a file share, a queue, a table. Great options. I'm going to choose storage account or service. Then we're presented with options for how we will connect to the storage account. To authenticate, will it be a connection string, a shared access signature, which gives us limited access to the storage account, or do you want to specify the storage account name and specify the storage account access key? Remember, there are two access keys for every storage account. You can use either one, and it gives full access to everything in the storage account. I'm going to go with next. Okay, so I have to fill in the storage account name, so I'll put that in here, and then I need to specify the account key. Let's flip over to the portal for a moment to get. Here in the Azure portal, I'll just go to my list of storage account. I will open the storage account in question, and on the left, I'll scroll down, and I'll click Access Keys. I'll click Show for key 1, although I could do it for key 2, and I want the actual key, so I'm going to copy it to the clip. And back here in Storage Explorer, that's what I'll paste into the account key field. This is for the standard Azure cloud, not Azure China or the Azure US government cloud. That's fine. I'll click Next. It summarizes my choices. Okay, down below, we've got a log area where it shows that it successfully added the new connection. If we go back to the Explorer view over here, our storage account is now shown here, and in parentheses, we have the word key because that's how we connected to it. And remember that the storage account access key gives you full access to everything in the storage account: blob containers, file shares, queues, and tables. Well, if we expand blob containers, here are some of the blob containers I've been working with. For example, if I open up projects, on the right, I see the actual blobs within that blob container. And the column headings are very helpful, like the access tier, when the blob was last modified, the content type here, they're just straight text files, and the size of those items. If I double click on any blob, it will either open it up automatically locally, that's what we're looking at here, it's opened up the file, or it will prompt me to download and save it. But when you have a blob selected, that's like clicking the open button. You've also got some copy and paste options, delete options. Notice what's interesting here is that we are in the project's blob container, and we have a new folder button here to create a new virtual directory. Here called budget, and I'll click OK. So it takes us into that new empty folder. So I'm going to click the upload button to upload a file. And once I've selected the on-premises file, I will click up. Okay, and now it shows up. So let's just close the projects tab up at the top here, click on something else and go back to projects. Notice that now the budget folder shows up within the project's blob container. Back here in the portal, if I were to go to my blob containers on the left, open up projects, there's budget, and I can see the content of it. But notice when you're in an existing blob container here in the portal, there's not a button, and there is no additional option in the context menu to create a folder within the blob container. So that's an important aspect and advantage of using the Azure Storage Explorer tool. In this demonstration, we're going to look at yet another way to upload blobs into a storage account, or potentially to download them from a storage account onto a device using the AZ copy command line utility. Here in my web browser, I've navigated to the Microsoft page where I can download the AZ copy tool. So it'll run on a variety of platforms, so Linux, Mac OS, and Windows variants. I'm interested in the Windows 64-bit zip file download, so I'm going to click on that. Unzip that download. It's going to end up with a notice text file and an azcopy.exe executable tool. Now you can copy that executable anywhere you want on your machine. Ideally, it will be in your system path, so you can type azcopy at the command prompt from any directory structure and it will work. Down the road, the azcopy login command will be deprecated in favor of using auto-login. But right now, I'm going to continue with this. It says to sign in, use a web browser to open a page, and here's the URL. And then we'll come back and we'll copy this code and enter it into that page. All right, so this is what that URL looks like in a web browser. It wants me to enter.
A page titled Sign into Your Account appears.
So I'll go back here in the command prompt and I'll copy that code. I'll paste it here and click Next. I'm then asked in the browser, are you trying to sign into Azure Storage AZ Copy? We downloaded it from the Microsoft page, so I'll just continue. It says you've signed in. You may now close this window. Okay, let's do that. Return to the command prompt. Okay, back in the command prompt, it says login succeeded. That's great. If I do a dir again, we'll see that I've copied a file into here that we're going to use for uploading into Azure. It's called employee_cards.xlsx. Back here in the portal, I'm now going to go to storage account in question that I'm interested in working with. I'm going to go to the containers view on the left, and on the right, I'm interested in the project's blob. So I'm going to click on the three container properties for the project's container. I'm interested in the URL here, https:// the name of the storage account, .blob.core.windows.net/projects. I'm going to copy that one. Now, while we're here in the properties of the storage account, I'll click Access Control IM on the left. The user account that was used to sign into that web URL where we entered the code, that account needs to have the storage blob data owner role or something equivalent in order to be able to upload blobs using AZ. So we can choose Add over here on the right assignment. I'll search for storage blob. There's storage. Select that and click. And then I would click Select Members and select the user, for example, that will be using AZ Copy. So they have that permission to the storage account. To have that permission to every storage account, you can go to your subscriptions properties and configure access control IAM in the exact same way, but we'll focus more on role-based access control later. So back at the command prompt, I've entered the command and I've run it. The command is AZ-copy employee_cards.xlsx. That's the local file name on my machine. The next parameter is going to be that blob container endpoint URL that we copied. But what I've added at the end of projects, which is the blob container, is / and then the name I want that file to assume when it's uploaded in Azure. It's really just the same file name, but in lowercase letters. Press enter, it will authenticate, it'll make sure you're authenticated to Azure, and then you've got some stats down below. So it's 100% complete, 1 done. So nothing has failed, nothing is pending or skipped or anything like that. And the final job status should say completed. So back here in the portal, if we go into our storage account again and into our projects blob container, notice the presence of the employee cards file. So that was placed there using the AZ-copy command. But also notice under the access tier column, the file we uploaded says hot inferred for frequently used files. That's the best access tier, but the other files in here are in the cool tier. Well, that's usually because their access tier was set separately from anything else. Hot inferred means that we picked up the default access tier at the storage account level and it applies to blobs that we upload unless we specify otherwise. In this demo, we're going to take a look at how to work with Azure Storage Account Blob Soft Deletion. Now, we know that soft deletion means that when we delete a blob in a storage account, it's not permanently removed at that time. As a matter of fact, when you create a storage account, the default settings are such that soft deletion is enabled and the purge interval is 7 days. If I were to choose create a resource here in the portal, I'll search for storage and choose storage account and for Microsoft, choose create. Okay. If I go to the data protection tab here, notice that the enable soft delete for blobs option is automatically checked on with the retention period of 7 days. So after 7 days, you will not be able to get that blob back once it's been deleted. But notice that we also have the option to enable soft delete for containers. That means blob containers. The retention period for that is also set to 7 days. And there's also even a soft delete option for file shares if you've configured shared folders within your storage account. And again, its retention period, after which you will no longer be able to recover it, is also 7 days. You can change that retention period. But again, once this retention period has gone by, you will not be able to recover these deleted items unless you have a backup of them elsewhere separately, which is always a great idea. Let's close that out. And what I'd like to do is navigate to an existing storage account. So I'll go to the storage accounts, interested in one called Store Account YHZ44. In its properties, in the navigation bar on the left, if I scroll down under Data Management, we have a Data Protection option. I'll click on that. This is where you get to these options after the fact, after you've created the storage account. So notice we've got the soft delete for blobs and containers with the retention. The reason I mentioned this is that you won't be able to delete a blob unless you're also deleting its snapshots. Okay, so what we're going to do is back out of that. Let's delete a file. We're going to delete project a.txt. So I'll select it. I'll choose delete. Are you sure you want to delete it? Here's where we have the option to also delete blob snap. This one doesn't, we know that, so I'll just ignore that and I'll click OK. Project A file has disappeared because we deleted it, but we know it's available for up to 7 days. And of course, towards the upper right, this is where the Show Deleted Blobs switch comes in. If I click on it, it shows me deleted items. The status will say deleted. And we've got the remaining retention period in days shown. If I click on that blob, notice I have an overview, versions, and snapshots series of options across the top, but with a blob that's not been deleted, We've also got the ability to edit the blob or to generate a shared access. So it looks a little bit different when it's deleted. Let's select the deleted blob. I'm going to click to go back into the properties of that deleted blob, and I'm going to scroll down here on the overview page, and I'm going to choose undelete. And just like that, we are back in business. So if we go back into our projects container, Project A is now back and available because we undeleted it. Now, what about deleting a blob container? Let's check that out. So I have a customer's blob container here. It contains a file called customer_data.docx. To select the checkbox to the left of customers, and I'm going to click the delete button at the top. It tells me that it will be soft deleted and recoverable for the retention period of 7 days. This we know. Are you sure you want to permanently delete this container and all its contents? We know it's not permanent until after the retention period. I'll choose confirm delete. Okay, so now it disappears. We no longer have the customer's blob container. But just like with deleted blobs, we've got a little button switch we can press up here to show deleted containers. When I do that, customers shows up. So I can go into the customer's blob container, scroll all the way down to the bottom where I can then click undelete, save, and customers is back. We're back in business. If I click that again to open it up, notice that it did also preserve the blob file that was in there. So that gives us a sense then of how blob soft deletion works and what its purpose is. Let's take a few minutes to explore blob versioning. Most document management systems have some kind of versioning capability. Even the Windows file system, for example, has this capability. So we can do this with blobs in a storage account. What we're talking about is having previous versions of blobs whenever a new change is written to a blob, and that becomes the current version. The reason this can be beneficial, of course, is if there was a mistake in writing to a blob, then it's easy to recover a previous version of it. Versioning is something that you enable at the storage. Let's take a look at an existing storage account called Store Account YHZ-104. Its properties, if I scroll way down on the left under the Data Management section, we'll find Data Protection. This will look familiar because we've talked about soft delete options, but that's not why we're here now. Down below under the tracking section, that's where we'll find Enable Versioning. When we do that, we have some options down below. Keep all versions. So if you've got a single blob and it gets a lot of updates that get committed or saved, you'll end up with a lot of versions for that single blob. That can add up depending on the nature of how many blobs are in the storage account and how they're being used, how often they're written to. But we also have this option to delete versions after a specific amount of days. I'm going to leave it on Keep All Versions, and I'll choose Save. Now, if you have versioning enabled and there are modifications made to blobs, and so there are previous versions that get saved, when you come back here, if you decided to turn off versioning, that's only from this point forward. So any captured blob versions will persist. Now, because in our case, we also have the blob soft delete enabled, that applies to blobs and their versions. So in other words, you have 7 days, because that's the configured retention period, where you can choose to undelete or recover deleted blobs and their versions. All right, well, let's test this out. I'm going to scroll back up in the left-hand navigator to continue. I'm going to open up the project's blob container where I've got a file called project A or project_A.txt. If I click on that blob to open it up and go to the versions tab here at the top, there are no previous versions. Notice that we do have an option to show deleted versions over here on the far right. I'm going to choose Edit to make a change to this file. I'll type in this is change 1. So I've added a new line to the file. We're lucky that it's a text file. It allows us to edit it directly. Otherwise, depending on the type of file, you might have to download it, use a specific app to make whatever changes you need to make, and then upload it back into the blob container. But here it's much easier for us. I'm going to click Save. Okay, it says it's saved. Well, that makes sense. If I go, let's say, to Overview on the left and back to Edit, it retained the change that we made. If I go to Versions, we now have a previous version, don't we? It's going to be the version without our added line, of course. If I click on that previous version, it pulls up the properties related to that previous version. Notice that the status of it is showing as previous. So when we go back to our blob container projects, we only see one instance of the project_a.txt file. What we have a reference to here is the current version. So again, if I click on it, go to Edit, yes, this is the current version. We made a change and we saved it. But let's go back to versions here a bit to the left, because there's a context button, the 3 dots to the far right of the previous version of this file. And of course, you could have multiple previous versions, by the way. Let's make another change. This is change. So if we go back to versions, now there are 2 previous versions. Well, that makes sense. But if I go back to the context menu to the right of any previous version, we can choose to download a previous version. We could choose to make a previous version the current version if we want to revert back to an earlier version of a blob because a mistake was made and we overwrote some important stuff. We can even generate a shared access signature for this specific version. That can be powerful. Of course, we can delete previous versions, change the tier, which is shown here as the cool access tier, or modify the access policy, which determines who can get to this preview. If I were to choose download, because it's a TXT file, it simply shows up in the browser here, and it's the original version of the file. It just says this is project thing. For the other version, download, oh yes, that would be the first change that we made and saved as the 3rd line that we added to that file. So that's just a little bit about how blob versioning works in Microsoft Azure. In this video, I'll be going through how to work with immutable blob storage. So when we talk about immutable, we're talking about not having the ability of going back to change something. It's read-only, but there are a couple of variations on how that can be configured in an Azure storage account. Let's talk about it. So what I'd like to do while we're talking about it is navigate to a left-hand navigator. I'll go to Storage Accounts. I'm going to open a storage account called Store Account YHZ-104 to open its properties. And if I scroll down in the left-hand navigator, way down under Data Management, I can then click Data Protection. This is where you'll find the versioning option. Wondering, versioning? Aren't we talking about immutable blob storage? Well, if you want to enable immutable configurations for versions, then versioning would have to be enabled. In addition, down below under Access Control, you would also have to turn on Enable Version Level Immutability Support. It's grayed out because this is one of those things you can only set when the storage account is being created. In our case, we are not concerned with immutable configurations for specific versions of blobs, because you can set it for versions of blobs or for blob containers, not regular current version blobs themselves. Okay, so now that we know where this is, even though we're not going to be using it, let's go back up in the left-hand navigator to our blob containers. There's one I'm interested in here called Projects. So I'm going to click on Projects to open it up. Of course, it's got some content. Would you want some kind of immutable configuration for these where they can't be modified? It could be legal-based. You might want to configure what's called a legal hold if, for example, you've been informed by law enforcement that some data must be kept in a read-only state, perhaps while an investigation is proceeding. The way we would configure that type of thing is by clicking Access Policy over on the left. This is the access policy for the project's blob container. You'll notice that down under Immutable Blob Storage, there are no configurations, but there is an Add Policy button. Click it. So legal hold is here. So you can apply a legal hold to prevent blobs from being modified or deleted. But of course, you can also turn off the legal hold at any time. Down below, you would specify some tag information that would be applied to the blobs. Usually the tag would provide some insight as to why there is a legal hold. It might include a law enforcement agency name. It might include a case number. So I'll just put here 1234556 as a case number. Notice you can add multiple tags. And I want to make sure that we don't allow any append rights to blobs in this container. Go ahead and choose Save to save that legal hold policy so it shows up down below. Let's navigate back to our blob container projects where we've set that legal hold. I'm going to click to open up one of these blobs. So if we navigate back into our project's blob container, if I try to, let's say, select one of the blobs and delete it, shots, sure, if there are any, I'll click OK, but yet it didn't disappear. If we take a look at our bell notification icon in the upper right, it tells us it failed to delete the blob because there's a legal hold on the blob container. So only admins that can manage blob containers off. We would simply go to Access Policy again on the left. To the far right of our legal hold, we can click the Context button, the 3 dots. We can choose Edit, remove any legal hold tags, and click Save. When you do that, it's kind of a strange thing, but that's how you actually remove the legal hold policy. So let's go back into our project's blob container. Let's once again try to remove project C. So I'll select it, delete, sure, delete snapshots, okay. This time it's gone. It succeeded as evidenced here in our notification bell icon in the upper right. But let's go back into the access policy for the blob container on the left, because you can also add a time-based retention. So you could specify a number of days, that's the unit here, where things are locked. What that means is that blobs would still be readable for whoever can normally have permissions to read them, but they can't be modified and they cannot be deleted until the retention period expires. And unlike a legal hold, you just can't randomly decide to turn off time-based retention. You have to wait it out for the number of days that are configured here. And that's really the only difference between a legal hold and a time-based retention policy. So that's how we can work with immutable storage configurations in Azure storage accounts. We've mentioned already that each blob can be configured in its own separate storage access tier. And you might change that depending on what your needs are. If you need some things that are not accessed often to be available, but not at the highest performance and thus less cost, then you can maybe use the cool access tier instead of the hot access tier. Or maybe you want to archive stuff for the long term, perhaps in compliance with certain regulations. Well, we can manage blob storage tiers quite easily in a number of ways, including here in the portal. I'm going to navigate in my left-hand navigator to storage accounts, existing storage account. I'll go to containers on the left. So I'm going to go to my project's blob container where I have a number of blobs. Notice that we have an access tier column. One of my blobs here is showing hot inferred for that. What that means is when that blob was uploaded into this storage account, the access tier was not specified at the time, and so it simply picked up whatever the access tier is configured at the storage account level, which is hot. Storage accounts properties. Specifically, if we go way down under settings and go to configuration, on the right, we can scroll down to find the blob access tier default setting for the storage account. Notice it's set to hot. So that's where that was. Let's go back into our blob container, navigate to that. We've got some other blobs here showing as being in the cool access tier. So the performance isn't going to be considered as high as it would be with the hot access tier. And of course, there is a minor cost differential. Notice that you can select a blob here and you can choose the Change Tier button up above. Let's take a look at what we've got. Hot, cool, which we know about, but we haven't really talked about cold or archive. With the cool access tier, this is designed for data that's going to be stored for at least 30 days and not accessed often. Whereas the cold tier is designed for data that is rarely accessed, and it's designed for data to be stored for at least 90 days. And then, of course, we have the archive tier. Now, this is considered an offline tier, as they call it, because when you archive something, you'll still see it here in the blob container as a stub reference, but the data isn't actually available until you rehydrate it, which means bring it back from the archive. So let's say I want to set this file, this blob, to the cold access tier. It does tell us changing the access tier may result in additional charges. That really depends on how much access there is to these items. So for example, the cold tier, while it costs less to store data that way than it would cool, it costs more to access the data in the cold tier than it does in the cool tier. Click Save, and sure enough, our selected blob is now showing access tier as being cold, where before it was cool. Notice though, if I select more than one blob, I can't change the access tier from there. Let's open up the Cloud Shell, because we can also modify storage access tiers at the command line. As an example, I'll switch over to PowerShell here. Let's say I want to set the default storage access tier for a storage account. I could do that using the set-az storage account commandlet -resource group name HQ-name. I specify the name then of the storage account, and then I use the -access tier parameter and set its value. I'm going to set it to cool in this example. It tells me this might result in additional charges. It's okay. Yes. So let's go back into the portal and check out that default setting in the storage account. I'm just going to click the refresh button in the browser to make sure we're seeing the most updated info. And on the left, I'm going to scroll back down to settings, and then I'll click configuration. And notice now the blob access tier default setting for the storage account at least is now set to cool. There might be times when you need to configure blob archiving in a storage account. Let's talk about data archiving and rehydration. Well, archiving really moves data that doesn't need to be accessed but still needs to be retained into an offline tier for cost savings. To get that data back so you can actually read it, you go through the rehydration process. So let's check this out. To our storage accounts view, open up a storage account that we know has blobs in it, and I'm going to go to containers on the left, open up my project's blob container. We know that we can view the access tier column for each blob, whether it's cool, cold, whatever the case might be. And we know that inferred means it picked up the access tier setting from the storage account setting because it wasn't specified when that blob was uploaded. But we can also select a blob and change its tier with the Change Tier button up. That, let me actually just click to open up that Project A file, and I'll click Edit, just so we can see that there are 3 lines of text in here, data to be read, in other words. If I go back to the Overview blade here, then Change Tier is available up at the top here. So what I can do then is switch it to the Archive tier. Now it says it will make your blob inaccessible until it's rehydrated back to either the hot or the cool tier, which are considered online tiers. And sometimes that can actually take hours. Well, that's okay. We need to see how this works. So I'm going to click Save. Okay. It says this blob is currently archived and can't be downloaded. That's true. Let's just go back here to our project's container. I'm just going to refresh my browser to make sure everything is up to date. Okay, so the Project A blob is now showing as being in the archive access tier. If I click on it to open up its properties, when I click Edit, we get a message about this operation not being permitted on an archived blob. The data is inaccessible until it's rehydrated, as we've discussed. So therefore, also, when I go into it, the download button is unavailable at the top. Can't download data that's not there. So if we need that data back, we can go into that blob. We can click the Change Tier button and move it from the archive tier, let's say, to the cool tier. Then we can select the rehydrate priority. Naturally, if you choose high priority, should rehydrate it, make it available more quickly, you will be paying more. I'll click Save. All right, now the message says this blob is currently rehydrating, high priority, and can't be downloaded. So how long will it take exactly? Impossible to predict. I'm just going to close out here and refresh our view. It's still showing as being archived, even if we refresh the web browser. And of course, the archive status is that the rehydrate is pending. Once it's been rehydrated, it's business as usual. What that means is that when we go into the blob, we can edit it because the data will be there. But it also means that we'll be able to download the blob and basically work with it as we did before it was archived. Now, what we're looking at here is manual archiving. Of course, it can also be done at the command line with the CLI and PowerShell, but there's also a way to automate this. We'll be focusing on that in another demo, but a quick mention here. If we go back into the properties of our storage account, if we scroll way down in the left-hand navigator to data management, there is an item under there that we can select called Lifecycle Management. And so this is where we can add rules. I'll just call this Rule 1. I won't be saving it. But we can create rules that apply to certain types of blobs, like block blobs, by far the most, and determine if that should apply to snapshots or versions of blobs. When I go next, we can look at when blobs, base blobs, were last modified or created. If it was beyond a certain number of days, then one of the things that we can do is move it to archive storage. So this is a way to archive, but in an automated fashion. Notice it does say that data in the archive tier should be stored for a minimum of 180 days. If it's not, and you change it to another tier like I'm doing, you will incur an additional fee. However, in my case, it's just for a demonstration, so it makes sense that I did that. So that gives us a sense of how to work with archiving and rehydration in Microsoft Azure. We've spent quite a bit of time talking about and working with blobs in a storage account. Now we're going to talk about how to work with lifecycle management. What this really is an automated way to move blobs to different tiers or to delete them after a period of either not being accessed or simply after a certain number of days after they've been. We know that we can go into a storage account here. We can go to the containers and we can navigate to the point where we have some blobs. Go into individual blobs, say, and click the change tier button at the top. And the archive tier, the cool tier, or as a better example, because this is a blob that's in the midst of rehydrating, we'll choose another one that's not. And then we have hot and cold also available. Change these. Remember, we change the access tier because we either want better performance, we want quick access to our blob, so in the hot access tier, or we want to save on costs for stuff we don't access often. So maybe putting things in the cool for 30 days or cold tier for at least 90 days. And of course, archiving as well for at least 180 days for things you need to hold on to but don't access. But this is all manual. So let's take a look at the storage accounts properties again in the left-hand navigation bar, and way down under the data management section, we will find lifecycle management. The way that this works is you can have one or more rules that apply to different types of blobs, and that takes some kind of action in terms of deleting those blobs or moving them to a different access tier. Let's take a look at it. Add a rule button at the top. I'll start by calling this rule 1. So the scope, apply rule to all blobs in your storage account or limit blobs with filters. When I do that, we get a filter set option up here. Let's leave that on for a moment. Below that, which type of blob should this rule apply to? Block blobs is selected. We can also turn on append blobs. Notice page blobs are missing. They're usually much larger files like virtual machine hard disk files. The blob subtype, the base blob, is the main current version blob, but should this rule also take a look at snapshots of blobs as well as versions? Remember, the difference between snapshots is that versions are created automatically when a blob is modified and saved. Snapshots have to be taken manually. Next, we can then determine if base blobs were last modified more than a certain number of days ago, let's say 90, 3 months. Then we can choose to delete the blob. If you have soft delete enabled in your storage account, the default retention period for deleted items is 7 days. You can still get it back if you need it. You might choose to move these blobs to archive storage because you don't want to delete them. You might be required by law to retain that data for a period of time. Archiving would work well in that situation. Or maybe move it to cold storage for rarely accessed data to save on storage costs. I'll choose that one in this example. Notice that we can add multiple conditions. I can add another condition down below, but in this case, I'll click the trash can. I just want the one condition. I'll click next. Here's the filter set stuff we were talking about. So we can enter a prefix, or a file path in terms of blob containers in the storage account that we want the rule to look at or apply to. And if you've configured blob index key and value pairs, you can also search based on that to determine which blob should be affected by this rule. Let's open another browser window here for the portal, because if we were to go into a storage account, and more specifically into an individual blob, it doesn't matter which blob it is for this example, but the point is that when you're in the properties of the blob under the overview blade, if you scroll all the way down at the bottom, this is where you can have blob index tag key and values. So that's what we're talking about, what the rule can look at here. However, I'm going to go previous, and I'm going to apply this rule to all blobs in my storage account. Okay, and then I'll click Add. So we've now added a rule called Rule 1. Now we could select Rule 1 and disable it. So we don't want to delete it perhaps, but we want to temporarily turn it off for whatever reason. Now an interesting thing to consider is that if you have multiple rules that would end up applying to the same blob, which one would take effect? Azure is smart enough to apply the least expensive rule. So, as Microsoft states, deleting a blob costs less than moving it to the archive tier. So if you've got two rules that apply to a given blob, one that deletes it, one that archives it, the blob is going to be deleted. Upload blobs using the portal, PowerShell, and the CLI. Then we went through how to manage blobs with the Azure Storage Explorer tool, how to copy blobs using the AZ copy command line tool, how to manage blob soft deletion, and how to work with versioning and immutable blob storage. Then we went through how to manage blob storage tiers and data archiving, as well as rehydration, which is part of reversing the archiving process, and finally enabling storage account lifecycle management. In our next course, we'll move on to explore how to secure access to storage accounts.